I was living a quiet, predictable life. My name's Jerry, and I'm 54 years old. I live in a small two-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, surrounded by people I barely know. It's the kind of place where the neighbor's broken sprinkler system becomes the subject of every conversation for months. The complaints are relentless. Every weekend, he'll either knock on my door or leave me a note about the water shooting up onto his yard. But I'm not really the kind of guy who shakes things up. I've spent most of my life avoiding conflict, just letting things slide, even when they don't make sense. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang. I picked it up lazily, expecting another one of those robocalls, but the voice on the other end hit me like a freight train. "Jerry, this is Deborah from the hospital. I'm afraid I have some bad news. Brianna, she's gone." I froze. My hand tightened around the phone, my heart skipping a beat as the words sank in. Brianna, my ex-wife. "Are you there, Jerry?" Deborah's voice pulled me back to reality, but it didn't make it any easier to understand what she was saying. Yeah, I'm here," I stammered, trying to find my voice. What happened?" "Sudden heart failure. We don't have all the details, but I thought you should know. We've scheduled the funeral for next Wednesday, and the will reading is shortly after. We'd like for you to attend." I stood there for a long time, my eyes staring blankly at the wall, trying to process what she had just said. Brianna was gone? After all these years? The woman I had once built a life with, the one I'd shared so many moments with, gone. And then the thought hit me. Why would they want me at her funeral? It felt like a lifetime ago when Brianna and I divorced. We hadn't spoken much in the years that followed. My life had settled into a rhythm of simple things: work, the occasional dinner out, weekends spent mowing the lawn and doing the odd chore around the house. Nothing fancy, nothing grand. In contrast, Brianna's life had taken off after the split. She'd built an empire of sorts, running a successful business that seemed to grow with each passing year. I couldn't even bring myself to hate her for it. I admired her, even if from a distance. She had always been the dreamer, the go-getter, the one who could turn nothing into something. And here I was just getting by. I was still in shock when my neighbor knocked on my door. He started rambling about the sprinkler again, but I barely heard him. I just nodded, saying I'd take care of it soon, though I knew I wouldn't. My mind was elsewhere, on Brianna, on the funeral, on the will reading. That evening, I sat in front of my TV, flipping through channels, but none of it made sense. Why had I been asked to come? Why wasn't Dustin, her son, handling everything? I had no idea what to expect, but I couldn't ignore it. Something about the idea of seeing her one last time, of closing the chapter on that part of my life, tugged at me. I didn't want to go, but I knew I had to. So, when the call came again from Deborah, this time reminding me of the funeral and the will reading, I simply said, "I'll be there." As I hung up the phone, the weight of it all settled in. Brianna was gone, and I was going to have to face the past. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What did her death really mean? What was the point of me being there? I wasn't the family anymore. We hadn't been family in so many years. So why was I being dragged back into this? The thought stayed with me as I lay down that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something unexpected was on the horizon. The same thought I'd been pushing away for years, that I had never truly left her behind. I sat quietly in the back of the chapel, trying to shrink into the shadows. The room was filled with well-dressed strangers, people who seemed to belong in this world of wealth and sophistication. It felt like I had stepped into a world that wasn't mine, a world I had no part in anymore. Brianna had been many things to many people: successful, driven, the kind of woman who could turn a small idea into an empire. To me, she had been the woman I once loved, but now she felt like a distant memory, like a person I once knew, but had no claim on anymore. The church was grand, the pews polished to a high sheen, the air thick with fresh flowers. Brianna had clearly gone out with all the elegance she'd always prided herself on. As the service began, I remained as invisible as possible, hoping no one would remember who I was, or what I'd once meant to her. I could hear whispers around me, little murmurs about Brianna's past, about her family, about the divorce. It wasn't hard to piece together what people were saying. My name would inevitably come up. Jerry, the man who walked away from it all, the man who had failed her, the man who had abandoned the family. I swallowed the lump in my throat as the priest spoke, but I could hardly focus on his words. My mind kept drifting back to the years before. The good years. The years when we were partners, when we had dreams and plans together. Brianna and I were a team once. But that was before things soured. That was before we drifted so far apart that neither of us knew how to close the gap. Then I felt it, a gaze. It was sharp, directed at me. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Dustin, Brianna's son. Dustin had always been distant with me. He was a quiet kid when we were together, but he'd grown into a man with a chip on his shoulder the size of a mountain. As I turned my head slowly, our eyes met. His expression was hard, his jaw tight with anger. The murmurs around the room quieted as he stood up, a powerful figure in his black suit, and strode down the aisle towards me. The room seemed to hold its breath as he reached me, standing tall over my hunched form. "You," Dustin spat, his voice carrying. "You're really here." "Dustin," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I'm here to pay my respects." He laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Respect? You think that's what this is about?" His face twisted in frustration. "You abandoned us, Jerry. You walked away from the family. You let her do all the hard work while you just sat back and did nothing." The room shifted uneasily as people around us began to pay attention. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel the eyes of the congregation burning into me. But I wasn't going to back down. "I didn't abandon anyone, Dustin," I said quietly, my voice measured despite the sudden heat rising in my chest. "I loved your mother, but after everything, she wanted more than I could give. She wanted a life I couldn't be a part of." "More?" He stepped closer, now nearly shouting. "She built an empire, Jerry. She built everything. And you just let her do it all while you went on with your miserable little life." He took a deep breath, and the anger in his eyes shifted into something more raw. "You weren't there for her when she needed you. You weren't there for me. You weren't there for anyone." I could feel the weight of every word, but I wasn't going to let him drag me into this any further. I took a deep breath, holding my ground. "I didn't come here for you, Dustin. I didn't come here for anything other than to honor the promises we made to each other." I looked him dead in the eye. "I may not have been the husband you wanted, or the father you needed, but I am here today because your mother was important to me." The room fell silent as Dustin glared at me, his fists clenched at his sides. He was shaking with emotion, but he didn't say anything else. His eyes were full of accusation, full of years of resentment that no amount of words from me could erase. But I wasn't going to let him tear me down in front of everyone. I wasn't going to let the past define me in that moment. Finally, Dustin turned and stalked off, his footsteps heavy on the polished floor. I sat there for a moment, feeling the weight of the silence around me. I didn't want to be the target of his rage, but in a way, I knew I'd brought this on myself. We all had. But I had said what I needed to say. And in the end, that was all I could do. The air in Dan Morrison's office felt unusually thick, as if everything around me was slowing down. I had only been in this kind of space once before, back when Brianna and I were still together, making business decisions and navigating the small complexities of our early life. But now, it was a different world, the world that Brianna had built without me. The leather chairs felt too soft, too polished, and the thick oak desk between me and Dan seemed to separate me from the reality I had been expecting. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Answers, clarity, some kind of resolution. What did I have left to even hope for? Brianna and I had been strangers for years, but now, here I was, about to hear what she had left behind. Dustin was sitting across from me, his face tense, eyes scanning the room like he was ready for something to go wrong. It was clear he wasn't happy about sharing this moment with me. He hadn't looked at me since we walked into the office. Dan cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We'll begin with the specifics of Brianna's estate, and then we'll move on to the will itself." I nodded, not really registering the words. I was trying to focus, trying to make sense of it all, but I couldn't stop thinking about how strange it felt to be here. This was all so far removed from the life I had. My little house, my modest job, my quiet existence. And yet, here I was, about to learn something that could change everything. Dan opened a folder, flicked through a few pages, and began. "Dustin, your inheritance includes the family home, valued at $3 million, and a sizable sum of money, $300,000 to be exact. This will cover some of your immediate needs. The business side of Brianna's estate, however, has been left out." Dustin's eyes narrowed. He looked confused, maybe even a little angry. "What do you mean it's left out? The business is part of everything." Dan hesitated before responding. "I'm afraid Brianna had her reasons. But for now, let's move on." I felt the weight of Dustin's frustration as he leaned back in his chair, clearly trying to process everything Dan had just said. I could see it in his eyes, the conflict between surprise and disbelief. This wasn't the kind of reading he had expected. It wasn't the kind of reading I had expected either, but for very different reasons. Dan cleared his throat again and continued. Now, for the final portion of the will. Brianna has named Jerry as the beneficiary of the majority of her business interests, including controlling shares of the company. Dustin's chair squeaked as he stood up suddenly. What? His voice was sharp, incredulous. Are you serious? She left him? The man who abandoned us? All of that? I felt the tension in the room shift, and for the first time, all eyes were on me. I wasn't prepared for this. I wasn't prepared for any of it. Dustin, I said quietly but firmly, trying to keep the situation from escalating. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of it. Bullshit, he snapped. You must have done something to convince her to leave you everything. I can't believe this. After everything, you get to walk away with it all. I could feel the anger rising in him, his fists clenched tightly, his face flushed with a mix of disbelief and resentment. The weight of the room suddenly felt unbearable, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest. But I wasn't going to let him control the narrative. Not now, not like this. I didn't manipulate anyone, Dustin, I said, my voice steady, though the words felt heavy in my mouth. I'm here because Brianna made a choice. She left this for me because, in the end, I was part of her life, no matter what happened after. That's all I know. Dustin stared at me for a long moment, and I saw the pain in his eyes. He wasn't angry just because of the money. He was angry because his entire world had been upended. It was clear this wasn't just about business or inheritance. It was about losing something, someone he thought he had a right to. Dan's voice cut through the tension. I think we should take a break and come back to this. Jerry, Dustin, we have a lot more to discuss, but it's clear this is a lot to take in. I nodded, my mind reeling. I had no idea what to make of any of it. The weight of Brianna's final decision was sinking in, and I wasn't sure what it meant. What was I supposed to do with her empire now? What was I supposed to do with this unexpected responsibility? Dustin didn't say another word as he stormed out of the room, leaving me alone with Dan. I wasn't sure if he was going to contest the will, or if he just needed to be alone to process the shock. Dan turned to me. You okay? I shook my head, feeling the weight of the situation. Number? Not at all. But I don't think I'll ever be okay with this. I don't know what to do next. Dan sighed, glancing at the door where Dustin had just exited. It's a tough situation for both of you, but we'll figure it out. I wasn't sure I agreed, but I didn't have the energy to argue. I sat back in my chair, feeling lost. The room was heavy with tension as the will reading continued. I could feel the weight of the papers in Dan Morrison's hands, but it wasn't just the will that was weighing me down. It was the reality of the situation. Brianna, my ex-wife, had left me, of all people, the majority of her wealth and business. I had expected to leave this meeting with some small token, maybe a note or a little bit of money, something to remember her by. But this? This was beyond anything I could have imagined. Dan paused for a moment, flipping through the pages of the will. And finally, he said, his voice steady but somber, the controlling interest in Brianna's company, valued at nearly $50 million, has been left to Jerry. He looked up from the paper, his eyes briefly flicking between Dustin and me. Dustin was silent for a moment, and I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Then, his chair scraped sharply against the floor as he stood up abruptly. His face was a mask of disbelief, anger, and something darker. Betrayal, maybe. No, he said, his voice shaking with rage. This is a joke, right? You're telling me she left him everything? I could feel the heat of his gaze on me, the weight of his words as they struck me harder than I expected. I had no idea how to respond, my thoughts racing in every direction. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. Brianna had distanced herself from me for years, so why now? Why leave me in charge of her empire? The woman who had built this life on her own, without me, had left me her legacy, her most prized possession. Dan cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable as he shifted in his seat. I understand this is a lot to take in, but the will was clear. He paused, but Dustin wasn't listening. His face was twisted with anger, and his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. You have no right, Dustin spat, his voice rising. You were never here. You left. You abandoned us. And now you're just going to walk in and take everything? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I wasn't sure how to explain myself. I wasn't sure I had an explanation. All these years, I had stayed on the sidelines, watching from a distance. I wasn't part of her world anymore. Hell, I hadn't even spoken to Brianna in years. So, why this? Why me? Dustin's voice cut through my thoughts again. This is unbelievable. You must have manipulated her in her final days. What kind of man are you? Do you think I'm stupid? I know you're just here for the money. I felt the weight of his accusation in my gut, and for a moment, I wanted to shrink away from it. The last thing I wanted was for Dustin to believe that. But the more I tried to explain myself, the more the words tangled up inside me. Brianna and I had gone our separate ways for a reason. I hadn't wanted this. I hadn't even expected it. I didn't ask for this, Dustin, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. I didn't manipulate anyone. I'm here because she chose to leave this to me, and if you think I want to be part of this, you're wrong. Dustin took a step forward, his eyes burning with anger. No, you don't deserve this, he growled. You never earned it. You never earned her. All you ever did was stand by and watch her build everything, and now you're going to take it all? Dan, sensing the escalating tension, leaned forward. Dustin, that's enough. We can't resolve this here. There's a process to follow. But Dustin wasn't listening. He was shaking with fury, his voice loud enough to echo through the office. You don't deserve it, Jerry. You never did. I'll contest this will. I'll make sure this doesn't stand. My heart hammered in my chest, as the weight of what he was saying hit me like a brick wall. A part of me knew he was hurt, confused, and angry. But another part of me couldn't help but feel the sting of his words. I had never expected this. Never expected him to accuse me of something so monstrous. I was still absorbing the shock of everything when Dan stood up, his voice firm but trying to calm the situation. Dustin, I understand you're upset, but these are Brianna's wishes. You have the right to contest them, but this will stand for now. Dustin looked from Dan to me, his face twisted in disbelief. He opened his mouth to say something else, but I could see the defeat creeping into his eyes. The rage was still there, but beneath it I could see the pain, the hurt of losing not just his mother, but the inheritance he had thought would be his. Without another word, Dustin stormed out of the office, leaving the room heavy with silence. I couldn't move, couldn't process what had just happened. The world felt like it was spinning out of control, and I was just caught in its wake. I didn't want this. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. Dan sat back down, giving me a long, careful look. Jerry, I know this isn't easy. I know it's hard to understand why she would make this choice. But the truth is, Brianna had her reasons. She always did things her way. I didn't have a response. The words didn't feel real. I didn't want to be part of the wealth, part of the business. I hadn't asked for this. But now, it was mine. I left the office soon after, my mind a whirlwind of confusion. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected to find myself in the middle of this storm. But now that I was here, I had to figure out what it meant, what it would mean for me, and for my relationship with Dustin. One thing was certain, nothing would be the same again. Dan Morrison sat back in his chair, flipping to the last pages of the will. The room was heavy with silence, Dustin's anger still hanging in the air like a storm cloud. I wasn't sure what to expect next, but the last few minutes had already shaken me to my core. Dustin's disbelief, his accusations, it felt like everything I thought I knew about Brianna was being torn apart. Like I was being dragged into something that didn't make sense. Dan cleared his throat and looked at both of us. There's one last thing, he said, his voice softer now, as if he could sense the tension that had built between Dustin and me. He picked up a final piece of paper and leaned forward. This is a personal letter Brianna left for Jerry, he said, glancing between us. She wanted him to hear this. She thought it was important, something she needed to say. I felt my chest tighten, unsure of what I was about to hear. Brianna and I had our differences, no doubt, but hearing her words now, after everything, felt like opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through. Dan unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the page as he began to read aloud. Jerry, my love, I know this will come as a surprise to you, as it will to others, but I have made the decision to leave you the bulk of my estate, the business, the wealth, and everything I built. I don't expect you to understand why I made this choice, but I hope you can hear me when I say this. You were always the one I truly loved. I pushed you away for so many years, thinking I could find fulfillment in my career, in my business. But deep down, I knew that I had lost sight of what truly mattered. Dan paused, glancing up at me, as if making sure I was taking it all in. My heart raced in my chest, a strange mix of disbelief and confusion twisting in my gut. Brianna had been cold to me for years. I hadn't expected her to say something like this, not after all the time that had passed. Dan continued reading. I spent so many years blaming you, blaming myself for the way things turned out. But I now realize I was wrong. I should have prioritized our family. I should have fought for you and for us. But I didn't, and that's my greatest regret. The business was my way of coping with everything I lost. But I should have never let it come at the expense of what we had. And for that, I am so sorry, Jerry. I hope that, in some way, you can forgive me. I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me. She had never said anything like this to me when she was alive. The regret, the apology. It was overwhelming, and I wasn't sure how to process it. I had always wondered if she had ever thought about the life we'd shared, if she ever regretted how things ended between us. But this felt like more than just a final goodbye. It felt like a part of her that she had never shared with anyone, something raw, something real. Dan's voice cracked slightly as he finished reading. Brianna went on to say that she believes you deserve everything she's left you. She acknowledges that the business was her pride, but she wanted you to carry it forward. She felt that you were the one who could honor it in the way she had always intended. I was silent for a long moment, processing the weight of her words. The message was clear, even if it didn't completely make sense. She had loved me deeply despite everything that had happened. And this inheritance, this business, wasn't just a fortune. It was her way of making amends. But as I sat there, trying to digest it, I noticed Dustin's silence. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken a word. His face was pale, his jaw clenched so tight that I could almost hear his teeth grinding. I could see the shift in him, his anger now mixed with something else, something deeper. Dan looked up from the letter, his voice softer. I know this isn't easy, Dustin, but this was Brianna's choice. Dustin didn't meet Dan's eyes. Instead, he stared at the floor, his fists clenching and unclenching. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. She always thought I wasn't ready. She always thought I wasn't enough, he said bitterly, his words cutting through the quiet of the room. She didn't trust me. She didn't believe in me the way I needed her to. I could feel his pain, even if I didn't fully understand it. He had grown up with a mother who was distant, focused on her career and her empire, and now, in her final moments, she had left him something he never wanted. Not the company, not the legacy, the money, the power, things he didn't feel he had earned. The room was silent again as Dustin fought to compose himself. His emotions were raw, laid bare for all of us to see. And for the first time, I saw him for what he really was. Someone who had always lived in the shadow of his mother's success, never truly able to break free of it. Dan shifted uncomfortably, trying to diffuse the tension. We'll need to discuss the legal aspects of this, but for now, I think it's clear that Brianna's choice was a deeply personal one. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling of Dustin's anger still hanging in the air, thick and palpable. This was more than just an inheritance. It was a final judgment, a decision that would affect all of us in ways we couldn't yet comprehend. But for me, Brianna's words had given me something I hadn't expected: closure. Her apology, her admission of love, it changed something inside me. I wasn't the man I had been when we divorced, but hearing her final message made me feel like I had been seen, heard. I glanced at Dustin, but he didn't meet my eyes. He was lost in his own thoughts, his own pain, and in that moment, I knew that I wasn't just here to take over the business. I was here to carry forward the legacy of a woman who had made mistakes but had loved deeply, even when she couldn't show it. I was going to honor Brianna's memory, not just for her, but for the family we once were. The tension in Dan Morrison's office was suffocating. Dustin had stormed out, his fury palpable as he disappeared down the hallway. I sat there, frozen in the aftermath, trying to process what had just happened. The reality of the situation hadn't fully sunk in yet. Brianna's business, her wealth, everything she had built, was now mine. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an enormous weight, a responsibility I wasn't sure I was ready for. Dan, sensing the stillness between us, let out a soft sigh and placed the will on the desk. I know this is a lot to take in, Jerry, but we'll need to move forward with the legal process. I nodded absently, my thoughts drifting back to Dustin, to the look of pure betrayal on his face. I didn't want to be the one who tore his world apart, but here I was, left with the inheritance that felt more like a burden than a blessing. Dan's voice pulled me back to the present. "You understand what this means, don't you?" he asked, his tone more somber now. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "I'm not sure I do," I admitted, the confusion still clouding my thoughts. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be named the beneficiary." Dan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I get it. Brianna's decision wasn't an easy one, and it's clear that Dustin is struggling with it. But you can't deny the fact that she chose you for a reason. She saw something in you, Jerry, something that maybe even you don't fully understand yet." I stared at the papers in front of me, the weight of her final decision sinking in. It wasn't just money that Brianna had left behind. It was her legacy, her vision for something greater, and now, somehow, it was my responsibility to carry it forward. I stood up, my mind racing. I'm not like her, Dan. I'm not a business person. I don't know how to run a company. I don't know what she saw in me. Dan didn't flinch. Maybe that's the point. Maybe Brianna didn't want someone who was just like her. Maybe she wanted someone who could bring a different perspective, someone with integrity, someone who would honor the values she once believed in. I didn't know if I could live up to that. My entire life had been quiet, humble, and safe. I had no experience in the corporate world, no training for the kind of responsibility that came with running a business like hers. I was a man who had spent years watching from the sidelines, letting life pass me by. And now, suddenly, I was expected to take the reins. I looked out the window, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. I don't know if I can do this, Dan. I don't know if I'm the right person for this. Dan's voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it. I think you are, Jerry. I think you've always been capable of more than you give yourself credit for. And now, you have the chance to prove it, not just to Brianna, but to yourself. His words lingered in the air, settling into my chest. I didn't feel ready, but the reality was that there was no turning back now. Brianna had left me this gift, this responsibility, and whether I was prepared for it or not, it was mine to carry. A few minutes passed in silence before I spoke again, my voice quieter this time. "What about Dustin?" Dan's expression softened. "Dustin is struggling. He's hurt. He doesn't understand why Brianna made the choices she did. But you can't let that define your path, Jerry. You can't let his anger control what you do next." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "But it's not just his anger, Dan. It's the truth. He's right. I didn't earn this. I wasn't there for Brianna when she needed me." Dan shook his head. "You weren't there in the way she wanted you to be. But that doesn't mean you didn't care. That doesn't mean you didn't contribute. Brianna knew what she was doing when she left you this. She trusted you." The words hung in the air between us, and for the first time, I began to see a glimmer of understanding. Brianna had trusted me, even after everything. She had seen something in me that I hadn't been able to see in myself, and now I had a chance to prove her right. I took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing on me. "I don't know where to start." Dan smiled faintly. "Start by doing what she asked you to do. Honor her memory, Jerry. Take this business and take care of it. You may not have all the answers, but you have the heart. And sometimes, that's all you really need." I nodded slowly, feeling a sense of resolve begin to form. Maybe I wasn't ready, but I had no choice but to try. Brianna had left me this legacy, and I would be damned if I let it slip away. This wasn't about the money. It was about something bigger, something I couldn't even fully understand yet. I stood up, straightening my shoulders. "Okay," I said, my voice firm for the first time in days. "I'll do it. I'll take the business. I'll make it work." Dan's eyes gleamed with approval. "That's all I needed to hear, Jerry." I turned to leave, my mind still swirling with questions and doubts, but something inside me was shifting. The weight of my inheritance was still heavy, but I was starting to see it for what it really was, a chance to change my life, to honor Brianna's memory in the way she had always hoped I would. As I stepped out of Dan's office and into the bright hallway, I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me. The road ahead would be difficult, but I was ready to take the first step. I had no idea what the future held, but for the first time, I felt like I was in control. I stood in the empty hallway of Dan Morrison's office, the sound of my footsteps echoing around me. The air felt different now, thick with possibility, but heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. The last few days had been a blur. The funeral, the reading of the will, the confrontation with Dustin. It felt like my life had been flipped upside down, and I wasn't sure what was going to come next. But one thing was clear. I couldn't let fear or guilt dictate my choices. This wasn't just about the money or the business. It was about honoring Brianna's memory. It was about proving to myself and to everyone else that I could be more than just the man who walked away, that I could step up and do something meaningful with what she had left me. I walked slowly down the hallway, the silence almost suffocating in its stillness. It was the kind of quiet that made everything feel more intense, more real. The kind of quiet that forced you to confront what you'd been avoiding. And I had been avoiding this moment for a long time. When Brianna left me the business, the wealth, the empire she had built, I had no idea how to take it. It wasn't what I expected. It wasn't even something I thought I wanted. But now, as I stood in this sterile office building, surrounded by walls of glass and chrome, I realized something. I wasn't here because of the money. I wasn't here because of some inherited fortune. I was here because Brianna had seen something in me that I hadn't seen in myself. She had trusted me with this, trusted me to carry on what she had started. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to do it. I pushed open the door to the office building's exit, stepping into the sunlight. The air outside felt crisp, the world full of possibility. I hadn't noticed it before, but as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I saw the vibrancy of the world outside, the colors, the sounds, the life that I had been missing. For so long, I had lived in the shadow of my past, weighed down by guilt, regret, and loneliness. But now, as I looked around, I realized that the future was mine to shape. I wasn't defined by Brianna's legacy, by Dustin's anger, or by the expectations that had always been placed on me. I was defined by what I chose to do next. And what I chose to do next was to honor Brianna's memory, not by simply running her business, but by doing it in a way that reflected the values she had tried to instill in me all those years ago. As I walked down the street, I began to make plans. It wasn't going to be easy. There was a lot of work ahead of me, a lot of questions to answer. I would have to step into a world I didn't fully understand, learn things I wasn't prepared for, and face the complicated legacy that Brianna had left behind. But, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could do it. I wasn't the man I used to be. I had changed, grown, learned from my mistakes, and now I had the chance to prove it to myself, to Dustin, and to Brianna. The weight of the inheritance, the business, all of it was still heavy on my shoulders. But it wasn't just weight anymore. It was a responsibility, a chance to make something meaningful out of what Brianna had left behind. And as I stood there, looking out over the busy streets, I knew that this was my new beginning. The world was still full of possibilities, and I was ready to take them on.